if you read newspapers and descriptions of, you know, the streets of Saudi Arabia or other places, the way that reporters will describe it, it's, you know, women are invisible. You never see women in the streets, or you never, you know, women are invisible in this society. In Muslims don't look at it that way. To be covered does not mean to be invisible, and to be uncovered does not mean that you are known. So I really want to stress that, because I think that's probably at the heart of a lot of the misunderstanding of the dynamics of an Islamic society and of a Muslim society. I also remember when we took a trip to Morocco, where I teach, the Hartford Seminary, and we went to, it was an interfaith group, and one of the women in our group, who was a non-Muslim, was very upset because she said, why do I just see men in the coffee shops and I never see women? And this is, you know, why are women stuck in their homes, and why can't they come out and go into the coffee shops? And she thought that this was a really bad thing. Now, the man said, you know, he was very nice, this Moroccan man, and he said to her very gently, he said, you know, what happens is that when women's friends come over to visit, the men leave the house so the woman can have privacy with her friends. And usually, because culturally, you know, the women are taking care of younger children, and so it's not as easy for them to go out and drag the kids everywhere to go sit in the coffee shop for a few hours. What happens is that the men, out of respect for their wives' privacy, so they can have, and these are people, ordinary people who live in small apartments, they don't have a lot of space, is that they leave and while their wives are visiting with their friends. So, you know, I mean, you could analyze that in many different ways, but there's a basic dimension to the whole culture that is being engaged in that society that's not understood, because things are looked at very superficially, just visually from the picture on the street, and then assumptions are made. Because women aren't sitting in the cafes, they're not doing anything. Or because women are sitting in the cafes, that means they have no life, or they have no social life, or they're stuck at home, you know, just scrubbing the pots and pans. Whereas there may be a lot going on in those homes. There may be what happens, for example, traditionally over the centuries in Muslim societies, where women have study circles, things called halaqas, so that they're running study groups. They're having all sorts of activities, but it's not necessarily in the same space as the men. So we have to look at those things and understand them. You know, anyone who's honest has to say that there's a problem with the way societies deal with women's bodies and women's sexuality. That's true in any society, and every society has a different way of dealing with it. And the most important thing in having a productive conversation is to acknowledge the flaws or the problems in our own society. And I think sometimes when we're having a discourse and when we're talking about Muslim societies, we're really unfair and we aren't recognizing our own problems. Now, there was something very interesting that I read in the New York Times about 2 months ago. I don't know if anyone knows of this author. She's an Indian author. She wrote The God of Small Things. Her name is Arundhati Roy. She's of Hindu descent. I assume she's some kind of practicing Hindu based on her novel, which was about different Hindu practices. Beautiful novel. She's also a social activist. She's very well known in India for protesting against very destructive environmental policies of the Indian government. And she argues a lot for poor people. Now, there was a great feature on her in the New York Times, and they mentioned that she used to have beautiful long hair, and that just before the interview she'd cut her hair to an inch short. And they asked her, why did she basically shave her head? She said, because I was so tired of reading articles about my book readings and interviews I had where they kept talking about my beautiful long hair. So I decided to cut it off. Now, that's a solution. That's one solution. Islam looks at things a little different. The way that Muslim women deal with this is that we say, you know, in public, we're going to wear a certain kind of professional dress that provides enough coverage that our hair does not get all of this excessive attention. And that's the basic difference between Muslim women's dress and Muslim man's dress, because the rest of it is you know, basically the same, and it's covering up. You know, if you look at any Muslim society, the men and the women pretty much wear the same thing, but slightly different fabric or form. So in Saudi Arabia, they wear the long one-piece gown. In Pakistan, they wear shalwar qamis. So it's almost always pretty much the same thing, little bit different cut, little bit different fabric, maybe colors. But the women, Islamic dresses, the women also cover their hair completely. Now, you could say, well, that's not the solution. You know, either you should just cut your hair off, or sexuality should be totally neutralized, or there should be, you know, we shouldn't have any, that, you know, people shouldn't pay that much attention to women's hair. But that's something that could be discussed. It's not something that's decided, and the assumption that this is necessarily a sign of oppression is incorrect. You know, also, something happened 2 weeks ago that really shocked me. I don't know why, but Greta Van Susteren got a plastic surgery. I don't know, I'm coming from America, and even though I'm Canadian, I've lived in the United States for so long, I think sometimes I make the mistake that Americans make, which is that we think that everyone, you know, the world revolves around the United States, so you all know, you know, all these American people. But anyways, Greta is, she's a lawyer, an American lawyer who became very famous during the O.J. Simpson trial, analyzing the trial. And then she got a position on Court TV, and then CNN, and then she moved over to Fox just recently. So I used to love watching her because frankly she was a rather plain woman. And but very smart, you know, very smart lawyer, analyzed the issues, and I just love to see her. Now, before she moved to Fox, she went and had hundreds of thousands of dollars of plastic surgery on her face. She's totally transformed. She looks totally different. And she said, well, they didn't ask me to do it. And this is a woman who's about 50 years old. She said, they didn't ask me to do it, but I just wanted to prove to all those boys who wouldn't date me in high school that they were all wrong. Now, you know, what's interesting to me is this is a woman who, I remember she was interviewing before the United States started bombing Afghanistan. She was talking with a woman about Afghani women. And the camera showed a picture of one of the new refugee camps that was you know, budding up in Afghanistan because they knew that the Americans were going to bomb, so people were fleeing. And it showed there were a couple thousand Afghanis who were gathering in this, you know, bare area, nothing there. They're under tents, not even real tents, basically blankets with sticks. And it showed, the camera panned in on this woman who was sitting there under a blanket that was being held up by a little stick. She was rocking this baby who was crying, clearly hungry, cold, tired. The woman looked exhausted. And she had the traditional, very colorful Afghani clothes on, a kind of puffy dress with the wide pants, and then this loose scarf over her head. And Greta Van Susteren said, you know, they were talking about the women's dress, Afghani women's dress, and she said something like, well, I mean, look, this woman, she certainly looks oppressed. And what was amazing was she saw the scarf on her head as the sign of oppression. She didn't happen to notice the tent, the lack of water, the lack of housing, the lack of food. But then this is a woman who later, 2 months later, goes and gets hundreds of thousands of dollars of plastic surgery on her face. On your face. I mean, the face, which is such a sensitive, personal area, it's who you are. You know, what is different between that and covering your face? What is the